Hello YouTube, Ace here, and today I decided I'm going to show the first of a new series of videos I'm doing called The Secret Weapons of World War I. This is because of the new Battlefield 1 game, and I decided let's have a look at some top secret equipment from that era. This first video will deal with land vehicles and artillery pieces. Now, before I begin though, I should mention that because many of the pieces of equipment I'm discussing are very obscure, it's difficult to find sources on them. That being said, I will be providing links in the description below to all the different little vehicles and artillery pieces for your consideration. Starting off, let's look at an Austro-Hungarian design from before the war in 1911. This is the Burstyn Tank, named after its designer, Günther Burstyn. It was actually a unique design because of the little arms at the front and back of the tank. These arms could actually be raised or lowered and allowed the tank to climb over obstacles easier. It should be noted that the Austro-Hungarian government did see some interest in this design. However, no prototype was ever actually built. Had it been built, it would have been equipped with a 30 to 40 millimeter cannon. Moving on, let's look at an Italian design. This is the Fiat 2000 heavy tank. It should not be confused with the Italian Fiat 3000, which was essentially an Italian version of the Renault FT. That being said, the Fiat 3000 did at least have some unique features, such as a better engine and 2 machine guns placed in the turret. Moving back to the Fiat 2000 though, there are at least a few things that can be said about this tank that are indeed impressive. For a start, at 40 tons, this tank was quite heavy by World War I standards, and it was equipped with one 65mm cannon in the turret, as well as 7 machine guns on the whole of the tank. Some sources typically state that it had 6 machine guns, however, if you look at the blueprints, it quite clearly shows that it had 7. Only 2 prototypes of the Fiat 2000 were ever built. And while they were built too late to see action in World War I, they did see combat in the rebellions in Libya shortly after. This next tank is actually a prototype that was tested by the United States Army in the early stages of its entry in 1917. This is the CL Best Tractor Company Model 75 tank. It was effectively an agricultural machine converted into an armored fighting vehicle. 2 of these prototypes were freely given by the company to the United States California National Guard, which tested them out and practiced with them. It was also used as a recruiting tool later on. Another prototype tank tested by the United States was the unoriginally named Steam Tank. This tank, clearly powered by steam, was equipped with a flamethrower in addition to the 4 machine guns mounted in the side sponsons. It was tested in France, but it was of course considered hazardous due to the fact that a direct hit on the steam engine of the tank could be potentially disastrous. Moving on, let's look at some of the more super heavy designs of the war. This is the K-Wagen tank of Germany. It was a 150-ton tank equipped with 2 650-horsepower engines, and it was to be equipped with 4 77mm cannons inside sponsons, as well as an additional 6 machine guns. Amazingly, by the end of the war, 2 prototypes had been partially built, one of them almost completely finished. Another super heavy tank design of World War I was the British Flying Elephant tank. This design would actually go through a sort of development hell, as the blueprints for this were revised many times, until a final design was settled upon. The final design was supposed to be equipped with either a 6-pounder or 13-pounder cannon depending on the source, and was to be equipped with an additional 6 machine guns, 2 at each side and an additional 2 at the rear. The weight of the tank was to be an impressive 100 tons, and amazingly, work began on a prototype in either 1916 or 1917, before it was inevitably cancelled. Unfortunately, the stage of the tank's development as far as prototype is not known. Yet another super heavy tank design of the war was the Russian Mendeleev Tank. This was a super heavy design of 170 tons, and was to be equipped with a 120mm cannon as its main armament. It was a blueprints-only tank, and aside from the main gun, the only other weapon this vehicle was equipped with was a single small Maxim machine gun and a small turret on top of the tank. This leads us into another Russian prototype tank of World War I. This is the Tsar Tank, which was tested in 1915. The trials for it actually started out decently enough. Unfortunately, towards the end, the rear wheel of the tank got stuck in a ditch and was unable to get out. Therefore, stronger engines were needed than what had been originally planned, and the design was ultimately cancelled. That being said, the Tsar Tank did have the ability to carry some impressive weaponry, as the turret on top could mount either machine guns or light cannons. In addition, the sponsons on the sides of the wheels could carry machine guns, and there was an additional turret underneath the carriage. Now, while the Tsar Tank may seem bizarre by today's standards, it was by no means the only big-wheeled tank of World War I. This is the U.S. steam-wheeled tank. It was designed by the Holt Tractor Company, and it was to be equipped with a 75mm cannon in front as well as 2 machine guns on the sides. It should be also mentioned that the steam-wheeled tank actually bears great resemblance to the next tank on this list, and that would be the German Treffas wagon. This steam-wheeled tank was actually a competing design with the A7V, and was to be equipped with a 20mm cannon as well as 2 machine guns. Rounding out the last of the heavy and super heavy tank designs of World War I that I'll be mentioning is the Char 2C. This tank was, as mentioned, designed in World War I, but didn't get completed until after the war. At 69 tons, it was very heavy by World War I standards, of course, but it was still comparatively fast, and in addition to this, it was easily the most successful super heavy tank design of that era, as 10 were built in all, although originally an order of 300 had been made. It was to be equipped with a 75mm cannon in the main turret. However, it would additionally have 4 machine guns, including one of which in a rear turret. Although the tank did not get to see action in World War I for obvious reasons, it did see some limited service in World War II, admittedly though as a propaganda tool for the French military. This next vehicle was actually unique because it was the first purpose-designed APC. This is the Mark IX. It was capable of carrying no less than 50 soldiers in the battle, and while it only carried 2 machine guns on its own, it did have slits that could be opened for the infantrymen inside to fire out of. Another unique feature is that a prototype variant of this was built with one special ability. It was amphibious. Now let's look at some light tank designs of the war. This is the skeleton tank designed by the US. It was a 2-man tank armed with a single machine gun in the turret on top. However, during testing, it was found to have good off-road capabilities and seemed rather promising. That being said, the war ended before much more work could be done on it, and therefore only the prototype was ever built. Before moving on to the next tank, I should mention its predecessor. This is the medium Mark A Whippet tank. It was actually a pretty decent little tank designed by the British during the war, and saw use in 1918, equipped with 4 machine guns. By the end of the war, the British government had already begun designing and building the medium Mark B, Mark C, and Mark D tanks. The Mark B tank was unique in that it had a total of 7 machine guns in it. It was only mildly faster than the Whippet, but at 18 tons it was still an impressive vehicle. The medium Mark C tank had fewer machine guns, but it was a much more faster vehicle and had heavier armor. Finally, the Mark D vehicle was the fastest of all. In fact, the medium Mark D tank could achieve a top speed of 23 miles per hour, which was extremely impressive by World War I standards. That being said, it did not get built until 1919 and was extremely unreliable. It did, however, have one major feature that the other tanks did not. It was also an amphibious design. The next tank on this list is the Ford 3-ton light tank. This was built by the United States, and at least 2 were sent to France for testing. However, it did seem quite favorable, as the United States government did place an order of no less than 15,000. That being said, the war ended before many of these could be made. It was a light tank, of course, but it had a two-man crew and was equipped with one single forward-facing machine gun. The next tank on the list is the Russian Vezdekhod light tank. This was actually a rather impressive little machine that could reach a top speed of 26.5 miles per hour. That being said, it did have a severe issue in that the prototype was unable to turn very well due to its design. Therefore, work was halted on the tank. It was to be equipped with a machine gun in the rear turret. Now, believe it or not, the Germans did have light tank designs during World War I. One of the more well-known designs, at least by the standards, are the Leichte Kampfwagen tanks. There were two models, the LK1 and LK2, but unfortunately neither of them were ever able to see combat, although a few prototypes of both were built. The LK2 had a 37mm cannon in the turret. Another German light or medium tank of the war was the Oberschlesien. This was actually about 19 tons, which would have made it a medium tank, and it was equipped with either a 37 or 57mm cannon, as well as two machine guns, one in the front and one in the rear, and it could achieve a top speed of 10 miles per hour on road. That being said, the war ended before any of these could ever be built. Well, that's about enough of the tanks, so let's move on to something else. Although I will admittedly be rather brief on these. During the war, there were several different SPG or self-propelled guns being made. Self-propelled guns are, of course, tracked motored artillery pieces. These were often made from the chassis of tanks designs of that era, such as the Renault FT and the Chammond, although the more famous SPG of the war was hands down the British gun carrier Mark I. I've decided to just include links in the description below to some of the various SPG designs that were either tested or used during the war. As far as stationary artillery pieces, I've decided to cover these individually, and we'll start off with easily the most famous of the entire war, the Krupp's 420mm Big Bertha howitzer. This was, of course, an extremely powerful artillery piece, and fired shells the weight of a small car. The artillery piece itself, however, was no lightweight. True to the name of Big Bertha, it weighed no less than 47 tons. Another very famous artillery piece made by the Germans during the war was the Paris gun. This actually had an enormous firing range of over 81 miles. Enough so that the Cornelius effect had to be taken into account when aiming this thing. Or more specifically, the rotation of the Earth had to be taken into account when aiming this thing. Moving on, let's look at one of the most interesting designs ever to come out of World War I, at least as far as artillery pieces are concerned. And it was invented by Frenchman André Fauchon-Villiply. It was called the electric cannon. And a small model of it was tested during the war between 1917 and 1918, until in July of 1918, the French government requested that Villiply build an artillery piece from the model that was between 30 to 50 millimeters. Although this is of course a small basis as far as cannons are concerned, Villiply seems to have considered the potential possibilities of his invention as a sort of counter to the German Paris gun. It should be mentioned that the electric cannon was actually an early example of Railgun, which is of course still experimental technology to this day. Unfortunately, there are no known photographs to exist of the electric cannon. However, we do have a few sketches here to show you. As a final note, let's look at this interesting vehicle referred to as the Wickersham Land Torpedo. It was built in the United States, and it was a remote-controlled vehicle that carried up to 1,000 pounds of explosives. Only a prototype was known to have been built during the war. However, the idea of a tracked mine or land torpedo did actually take off in World War II, the most famous example being the German Goliath tracked mines. Well, that's about it as far as the land vehicles and artillery pieces are concerned, at least as far as I will be covering. However, I'm sure some of you are curious about what the next episode of this series will show, so here's a little sneak peek. I hope that you're as interested as I am. See you guys again soon. Ace out.